All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. You know, when you see a title like this one, Global Energy Crisis 2024, why USA, Europe, and India are fighting for survival,
Oh,
I mean, it kind of grabs you, doesn't it?
it does kind of make you sit up and pay attention.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking at today. It's, excerpts from this report. We're going to be diving into all this stuff about what's going on with energy around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I think a lot of people, when they hear energy crisis, they kind of think back to maybe like the gas lines in the 70s or something.
Oh, yeah.
But this report argues this is something a lot bigger than that.
Yeah, it seems like there's so much more to it. This report talks about a fight for survival.
Right.
What makes this energy crisis different from the ones maybe our parents or even grandparents went through?
Well, I think the big difference is that we've got a whole bunch of things happening all at the same time. You know, you've got the war in Ukraine, obviously, that's completely disrupted global energy markets. Then you've got the lasting effects of the pandemic. You know, we're still feeling that in supply chains.
Right.
And then on top of all of that, you've got climate change, which is, forcing everyone to completely rethink how we get our energy.
Well, yeah, that's a lot to deal with all at once.
It is. It's a perfect storm. And I think that's why this report uses that kind of dramatic language, survival.
Yeah.
Because it really does feel like the stakes are incredibly high right now.
And they keep mentioning those three regions, the USA, Europe, and India.
Yeah.
Is it just because they use a lot of energy, or is there a deeper reason for focusing on them?
Well, it is partly because they're huge energy consumers, obviously, but I think the real reason they're focusing on them is that they represent like three totally different pieces of this global energy puzzle.
Yep.
Like the US is still really dependent on fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, that kind of thing.
Right.
But at the same time, they're also putting tons of money into renewables, like solar and wind.
Yeah, they're kind of caught in between.
Exactly. It's like this tug of war between the old and the new.
That makes sense. What about Europe? How do they fit into this picture?
Well, Europe has really been pushing hard for green energy for a long time now.
Mhm.
But their big problem is that they've been really reliant on Russia for their natural gas. And that's obviously become a huge issue with the war in Ukraine.
Right. Yeah, they've been hit pretty hard by that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really exposed just how vulnerable they are in this whole energy crisis.
So the U.S. is kind of in this tug of war. Europe is dealing with the fallout of the war in Ukraine. What's going on with India?
So India is interesting because their economy is growing super fast and they've got this huge population. So their demand for energy is just skyrocketing. And they're trying to, balance that with the need to be, environmentally responsible with their energy choices.
It sounds like each region is facing a completely different beast when it comes to this energy crisis.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, they each have their own unique set of challenges.
Let's get into the specifics of how this is all actually playing out. Can you give us some examples of what's happening on the ground in these different regions?
Yeah, sure. So, for example, in the US, I mentioned all the investment in renewables. Well, the report talks about these massive solar farms they're building in Texas.
Oh, wow.
But they're facing a ton of pushback from fossil fuel lobbies and, kind of getting caught up in political battle.
So it's not as simple as just flipping a switch and going green.
Not at all. There's a lot of
Oh,
resistance.
Well, what about in Europe?
So in Europe, the whole situation with Russian gas has caused this ripple effect. I mean, you've got factories closing down because they can't afford the energy prices.
Okay.
You've got countries talking about energy rationing. And then on top of that, you've got all these European countries just scrambling desperately to find other sources of energy.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're having to pay way more for it. So that's really hurting their economies.
And how's India handling this surge in energy demand?
Well, they're struggling to keep up, to be honest with you. I mean, the report talks about rolling blackouts, which are a huge problem when you're trying to run a modern economy.
Absolutely.
It's really putting the brakes on their economic growth.
It sounds like things are pretty dire across the board.
Yeah, I mean, it's a serious situation, but the report does talk about some potential solutions. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, so there's hope.
There is. I mean, one of the big things they talk about is technological innovation.
Okay, what kind of innovations are we talking about?
Well, renewable energy technologies are getting way more efficient and cheaper, which is huge.
Right.
And there's a lot of really cool stuff happening with battery storage, which is going to be key if we want to rely more on solar and wind power.
Yeah, because the sun's not always shining and the wind's not always blowing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the issue with those renewable sources.
Yeah.
But if we can store that energy effectively, then that problem kind of goes away.
So it's not just about switching to renewables, it's about making them work reliably?
Exactly. We've got to make sure that we can actually power our homes and businesses with these new sources of energy.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about policy changes? Are governments doing anything to help address the crisis?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some countries are being a lot more proactive than others. But for example, some European countries are really pushing energy efficiency measures like stricter building codes for new construction so that new buildings use less energy.
Oh, wow.
And they're giving people incentives to, retrofit their homes with better insulation and energy-saving appliances, that kind of thing.
Smart. It all adds up.
Exactly. And it all helps.
But what about the bigger picture? Can countries actually work together to solve this problem? I mean, they're all kind of competing for energy resources.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
The report really emphasizes that no one country can solve this on their own. It's a global problem and it needs global solutions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we need countries to cooperate on things like diversifying their energy sources, not putting all their eggs in one basket, and coordinating their energy policy so that everyone's on the same page.
So we need more international cooperation on energy.
Absolutely. And it's not just there are already some international agreements in place on climate change and energy security, but we need to move faster. We need to get things moving quicker.
So we got some glimmers of hope, but we've also got a long way to go.
That's a good summary, I think.
If our listeners take away one thing from this deep dive into the global energy crisis, what should it be?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this is a global issue and the solutions have to be global too.
Yeah.
The US, Europe, and India may be facing different specific challenges, but they're all connected. We can't just look out for ourselves. We have to work together to find a way forward that works for everybody.
Absolutely. And on that note of global cooperation and working together, I think this report leaves us with a really important question to think about. What role can we as individuals play in all of this? I mean, can we be more mindful of how much energy we're using? Can we choose to buy energy-efficient appliances? Can we walk or bike instead of driving whenever possible?
All great questions.
I think it's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about these massive global issues. But the reality is that all of our individual choices do add up. If millions of people make small changes in their daily lives, it can actually make a real difference.
I think that's a good point to end on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the global energy crisis. It's definitely a lot to think about, but hopefully it's given you a better understanding of what's at stake and what we can do to create a more sustainable energy future. Until next time, stay curious.